All right, end grain cutting boards. It's a great project. Great way to use up some of your wood scraps. I've already done a video on long grain cutting boards. If you follow this link, it'll bring you right to it. You're going to want to watch that video and follow the steps, the 5 tips I showed there, to get your scrap pieces glued together like this. And now on the end grain cutting board, we're going to slice it into pieces and re-glue them to get this piece. Now this is a perfectly acceptable long grain cutting board if you follow those 5 tips I show there. But if you just like the look of an end grain cutting board, or if you have a lot of pieces with defects, the end grain cutting board is going to give you a lot more chances to either hide those defects or to get rid of them without eliminating that whole board. Whereas if I'm doing a long grain cutting board, this board's just got to go. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to head over to the table saw. All right, so you've got your board glued up. We're going to need to cut it into sections and then glue those together to get our end grain cutting board. A couple things I want you to know. One is you want to use the proper blade. I have installed here a 40-tooth combination, and to me that's the right amount. It's enough teeth so that we don't have a lot of tear out. If you're using a 24-tooth rip blade, you're going to have tear out like crazy on the underside. It's going to make it tough to glue it up. But if you have something like a 60-tooth crosscut blade, because we're going to have wood on both sides of it, it's going to heat up and smoke a lot and want to come back at you. So 40-tooth combination blade is the way to go. And then I'd really like to see you use a crosscut sled. That's what I'm going to use. But if you don't have time to make one, you can use your miter gauge. Just screw a board onto it to get a longer reference surface so it can handle this large piece. And then to get a consistent cut, which is going to make flattening this a lot easier, I don't want to see you just use your fence. What I'd rather see is you take one of your scrap blocks from your cutting board, so it's something substantial, and clamp it on there with an F-clamp. Okay? And then when we make a cut, we'll take our piece and press it tight to that block. That way, as we guide the piece through, there's space in between the fence and the workpiece for it to drop off and not bind. If it binds there, it's going to come back at you. Okay? So this is acceptable. Crosscut sled's better. Let's use the crosscut sled. All right, so I have my pieces cut in sequence. You'll notice I stopped at the end of each cut and let the blade come to a full stop as I remove the piece to make sure it didn't bind. Another thing I want to warn you about is when you get down to the end, don't get greedy. Don't try to cut this one on the table saw. Just take one, trace it, and go get it on the bandsaw. Okay, it's a lot safer. So now that I have these ready, you can see my grain lines line up nicely. I'm going to bring it over and glue it up. All right, now I'm ready for glue up. Let me show you some of the things I did to get ready for glue up. First thing I did was I grabbed a scrap block to raise this whole thing up, and that'll let me get clamps and not without bumping into the table. I also have some cauls here. These are some straight pieces that I've added some painter's tape. You could add packing tape, something to keep the glue from sticking to your caul. That way you can reuse them, and that way you're not also scraping remnants of your caul off the back of your cutting board. It just makes things easier. So now that I have that set up, I'm going to line these up like this, and I'm keeping this basic. It's an all maple cutting board, and I'm just having the grain lines follow through. Some people get crazy with them, alternate the woods, alternate the grain. That's somewhere we could grow to. For right now, if you want to check that stuff out, I'll leave a link in the description below to some other YouTubers who are doing awesome stuff with that. I have my clamps all ready. I like to use these F-style clamps on this. It just makes it easier for me to get in there because I'm introducing these cauls to keep it flat. I use different clamps in the flat cutting board video. If you haven't seen that yet, there's a link right here. And then I want to be careful about what glue I use. Now, I've had some people say in the comments that yes, all 3 of these are food safe, and I wasn't clear enough in my first video that I want to use Titebond 3. And the reason for that is specific to the purpose of a cutting board. All of the other Titebonds, as they dry, they flatten out. They sink back into the joint if you have a small little gap, whereas the Titebond 3 has a little bit of a filler. It fills that gap to a small extent and reduces the risk of you having a pocket where a bacteria can form. I also like that it's waterproof. Some people said the other glues have the same rating, but really what I'm getting at for this is that filler. It's also handy that it has a longer open time. It gives you more time to line your grain up, okay? So with that said, I'm going to get right to it. No need for a glue brush or roller Picasso. Instead, we are going to just slap this on both sides. We're going to work from the outside towards the center. It's just easier. I think you'll find you fumble with it less. And then I'm going to put this on, slide it back and forth, and then tilt it. And you see, I get good even glue coverage there. If you're not sure if you got good coverage, just check it again. Okay. I can use a little more in the front there. Right, so you have a chance to check yourself. And that looks good. I'm going to proceed, and now I'll take these, tilt them over. And while I'm gluing up, if you've gotten this far, probably want to subscribe, so why don't you go ahead and hit that subscribe button while I get this glue on. Oops. So watch the calls. Sometimes they rotate on you. All right. That's a tough thing with these end grain cutting boards, is that it's just so much surface to cover. I might have been well served to screw this call down to that block. So let me get these grain lines lined up. And another reason why I like the Titebond 3, it gives you that extra time. You have a longer open time with Titebond 3. And so I'm going to get my first clamp on. I'm not going to go crazy with the pressure, just enough to keep it. If I tighten it too much at first, it's going to start sliding all over the place. Let's get pressure along the whole cutting board and our clamps on the call before we start. See how this one started to slide up? That's why I need the call. It's going to keep it flat. The flatter it is, the less work we have to do to get it flat afterwards. And then you have a nice flat cutting board that you can use both sides of. Right, so you can see these F-style clamps I can really get in there. Get them lined up right over each other. It's a little awkward until you get clamping pressure on both sides, but it's worth it. It really saves a lot of time later because you'll flatter the surface. See, now I can start applying more pressure. All right. So you can do it without dropping it this time. So now I've got pressure on the calls. That means I can add more pressure to the clamps. It won't slide around so much. All right, so you get the point. Now I'm going to add some clamps to the top, let the glue dry for at least an hour, and come back to it. All right, so our glue up's dry enough to work on. You can see our piece stayed nice and flat, and the calls really helped keep it flat, but putting that tape on it kept it from sticking. So I don't have any residue from my call to take off. Now I'll just scrape off the glue, and I'll flatten it before sanding. So that's our next video. Why don't you follow through to watch that. Hit subscribe, and if you've got any questions, I'll see you down in the comments.